You know, so that kind of thing, like, well, you're not doing my kind of Christianity. The reality is there's a story that emerges when you read the entire manifesto. In the beginning, he says, you know, I wasn't particularly religious. Then I sort of glommed onto Christianity. I realized I had to have a Christian identity. And by the end, he says he is religious. And you know, as I said, he's citing a lot of scripture, Bible verses. Bill O'Reilly says he's not even Protestant. He agrees. He sees himself as being called back to Rome, to Catholicism. He described having high hopes for Pope Benedict early on, when Benedict said some very extreme anti-Islamic things, but he's been disappointed. He doesn't think Benedict is the right guy. But again and again, he says, look, I'm doing this for Christ. He even, at one point in the manifesto, talks about, he says, you know, some people have a personal relationship with Jesus. I don't. So that's being used to say, well, then clearly he's not a Christian. It's worth noting that by the end, he gets that personal relationship. But it's also worth thinking about the tradition he's in. He's not in the kind of American emotional evangelical tradition of Protestantism. He's in fact very critical of that, and again he goes to American sources. He cites a priest, Father Dwight Longedecker, Bob Jones, University alumnus who converted, and writes a very long critique of what he sees as sentimental Christianity. He prefers what he describes as Crusader Christianity, and in that he's not alone on the American Christian right.
In your book, Jeff Sharlet, your book C Street, you talk about Chuck Colson. Can you talk about Chuck Colson and evangelical Christians here?
Yeah, he doesn't mention Colson, but you know, ideologically, I think that's really the kind of closest match. Colson, in a lot of ways, might be seen as advocating a Crusader Christianity as well. He shares a lot of sort of ideas with Breivik. First of all, very militant anti-Islam, as Chuck Colson, who's the head of something called Prison Fellowship, Christianity in prisons, told me at one point. He says, you know, at this point, mainly we're doing this to fight a war with Islam in prisons. Breivik actually proposes the exact same thing for Norway. He says we need to fight Islam in prisons by sort of this kind of aggressive conversion campaign. But they also share a kind of a medieval fetish, a kind of idealization of knighthood and manliness, and an explicit and open antagonism toward the Enlightenment. And that's what puts Colson in this sort of more interesting place than a lot of other Christian right leaders. He comes out quite plainly and says the problem is the Enlightenment, as does Breivik. And it really even comes down to their vision for what kind of society they see. So, for instance, these folks who are saying that Breivik is not a Christian aren't reading the portions in the manifesto in which he describes the ideal society they want to believe will be Christian government. He sort of goes back and forth and engages the arguments within the Christian right. Should we call it theocracy or should we call it something else? But really, they're sort of borrowing from a kind of a Colson idea of merging these things and giving Christianity dominion over all of society. But he says, with great generosity, that you don't have to convert. You just have to allow schools, courts, government to be ruled according to the Bible.
Interestingly,
so
Colson talks about
really comes.
Interestingly, Colson talks about Christian conservatism and the culture war in Norway. Is that right? And talk about the connection of what you write about the family to Norway.
Norway is unusual, actually, and having had several years ago, their prime minister was a very active member of the family, and the Norwegian press did a much better job than the American press, and putting this on the front page for weeks in a sort of minor scandal when they discovered all these sort of connections of this the previous conservative Norwegian government to this American Christian right group, and
the
around
family
that same time. Oh, I'm sorry. The family is another prominent American Christian right organization, headquartered in Washington, really dedicated more to this kind of, certainly not this Breivik kind of stuff, but more to that idea of a kind of Christian government. Colson converted to Christianity through this organization, was long identified with it, and at one point was looking at Norway and said he was greatly heartened by the rise of a new Christian conservatism in Norway, and and talked about the Viking spirit that was rising. The founder of the family was a Norwegian who's, in fact, named his autobiography Modern Viking. And you sort of see that same sensibility in Breivik, who sees himself as a Viking rising again to fight, what he sees as a Muslim horde.
Now, this in no way is to link any of the people you've just talked about to the violence that has just taken place, this massacre that has just taken place in Norway.
No, absolutely not. And I think that's incredibly important for us to remember, anyone who cares about free speech, and also anyone who's ever written anything and seen it interpreted in a way that they didn't like. Breivik pulled the trigger. Robert Spencer didn't shoot anybody. Chuck Colson didn't shoot anybody. And they didn't call for shooting anybody. They do produce a rhetoric that kind of walks right up to the edge of things. I mean, if you are out there like Robert Spencer or some of these other American conservatives and saying Islam is a religion of violence, there can be no accommodation with it, they're trying to destroy us, and then you sort of say, well, and what to do about it? I don't know. You decide. Well, Breivik decided. Breivik took, a kind of logical next step from that rhetoric. And that's part of why I think it's troubling when people sort of attempt to dismiss him as a madman and not deal with the politics that are very much a part of our, unfortunately, mainstream political discourse that walk right up to the edge of violence. Or, in the case of U.S. war in the Middle East, I've reported on this in the past, and we talked about this on the show here before. A number of senior American officers, Lieutenant General Bruce Pfister, described the war in Iraq and Afghanistan as a spiritual war of the greatest magnitude. There was video of the top American Army chaplain in Afghanistan saying that they're fighting in Afghanistan for Christianity. So it's important to recognize that none of these writers are responsible for this, but they are engaging in a rhetoric that sort of walks right up to that step of violence, and Breivik took the step, and it's a little disingenuous for them to say, well, we never imagined anyone would do that.
Of course, his lawyer now is talking about pleading insanity for Breivik.
Yeah, and I mean, that's what, it's a lawyer's job to find the best defense. There's not a whole other, a lot of angles on which to defend this guy, especially because he surrendered and openly admits doing it, all of which he describes in the manifesto. He describes exactly what he was going to do. He says, here are statements that you can read at your trial hearing. It's important to try and get a trial, he says. And, there's something very reminiscent there of the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, who's another American source who he quotes from. Ted Kaczynski was furious because his lawyers insisted on using an insanity defense. Very troubled man, but he knew what he was doing, and he wanted to talk about it. He wanted to share his violent rhetoric. And he correctly, I think, identified that desire by the press and others to call him insane as a refusal to recognize the political critique he was making. I think we need to recognize it if we're going to refute it. If we kind of plug our ears and say inexplicable evil, then we're not going to learn anything about it, and we're going to be surprised the next time it happens.
I want to thank you for being with us. Jeff Sharlet, author of the bestseller The Family, contributing editor for Harper's Magazine and Rolling Stone, also author of C Street, The Fundamentalist Threat to American Democracy. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. Jeff Sharlet was speaking to us from Dartmouth College, where he is an assistant professor of English.